For thousands of years, plague, superstition, and murder have drenched Britain and Ireland with blood and misery. Those dark memories still haunt our ancient lands. That's why we call them the Spooky Isles.
Hello and welcome to the Spooky Isles. My name's David Saunderson, and as always I'm joined by my co-host, the writer, occultist and expert on everything spooky, John Kanako James. Good evening, John.
Hello, David. How you doing?
I'm doing very well. It's slightly balmy here, but maybe it's just me. I don't know.
No, it's the hottest day of the year so far.
Is it? Okay. It's very steamy here in the King and Queen here in central London. Anyway, tonight we have a very special guest with us. Kaja Franck is a London-based academic who's currently focusing on a subject very close to both of our hearts here at the Spooky Isles, werewolves.
Yes.
Now, Kai is completing her PhD thesis on werewolves in British and American literature at the University of Hertfordshire. And to make things even cooler, this isn't the first time she's been able to get away with it. She's focused on spookiness in her studies elsewhere, where she completed her master's at the University of Sheffield studying vampires. You must have the most fun as a student ever.
I'm pretty sure I actually do, yes.
How do you ever get to study werewolves or vampires at university?
Well, basically, it started from the age of when I was 10, and I got obsessed with vampires because I decided to stay up and watch Interview with the Vampire. I've always sort of liked the dark characters. I wanted to dress up as Maleficent and not as one of the princesses. In the Shakespeare Sisters, when they released that song, I wanted to be the evil one. Yeah. And so I always read a lot about vampires. And then when I got to do my undergraduate degree at the University of Sheffield, it was time to choose a dissertation subject. And I'd started searching and I realised that plenty of people were writing about vampire literature and there was no reason why I shouldn't. And it also crossed over into my other chosen sort of areas of theory, psychoanalysis and gender studies. So I started writing about the classics there. So I looked at Christabel and Carmilla and Dracula, and then also The Historian, which is a modern version of Dracula by Elizabeth Kostova. And then when I did my master's, again, just came to dissertation time, and this time I really threw them a curveball, and I said, I'm going to study Twilight. And they were, well, I won't lie, I think among my professors there was a little bit of an idea of she's got to be kidding, she can't actually mean Twilight. But I did. And it was the first vampire book that I'd actually picked up after I finished my undergrad dissertation.
You must be one of the few people, I mean, I can't imagine many people around the world have probably studied that yet.
There are some books. They tend to be, the ones that I've read are relatively, I don't want to say lightweight, but they're not necessarily very, very academic. There is starting to be an increase in really good academic work looking at Twilight.
These kind of 5-minute books where they write about Robert Pattinson as how hunky is he?
Yeah, well, yeah, a little bit, but there's also stuff that sort of maybe
I apologise for knowing who Robert Pattinson is, by the way.
It's all right. I think you wouldn't be alive today if you didn't know who he was. It's part of the cultural background. Basically, I think a lot of them were sort of very much looking at the historical context more than anything else. And I was trying to actually put it to connect Twilight not only with our culture and our obsession with consumerism and celebrity culture, but also connect it to very early Gothic texts, so Anne Radcliffe's works, and saying that there's a very close relationship between this early romance and this modern Gothic romance, as opposed to Twilight necessarily being part of the vampire oeuvre. And then when it came to werewolves, I just decided no one's writing on werewolf literature, so it's time someone does.
Well, you got from my limited knowledge of Twilight, I believe you have werewolves and vampires in.
Well, technically, you have shapeshifters and vampires, because in the final book, there's an about turn, and it turns out these people who you thought were werewolves were never werewolves. They were Native American shapeshifters. And there are actually werewolves, but you never see them.
Can I actually say, that makes them much more authentically West European werewolves than actually any werewolf you've ever seen in any film.
Tell us more about whatever that was.
Right, because the thing is, I mean, as Kaja probably has come across already in her studies, if you go back to, and I'm putting big inverted commas around this, proper werewolves. By this I mean like early pre-Christian and early Christian in this country and in Ireland. That's what they are. They are these semi-shamanistic characters. They lie down, go into a trance, and they become wolves very often because wolves are really useful. They're seen as being intelligent, they're seen as being tough, etc. But they can actually become anything. And there are these wolf shamans in Ireland who at one point give a big long list of what they can become. And it's just that werewolves are kind of one of the favourites.
That's a bit like Warcraft, really. You get a
Pretty
choice
much,
of thing.
yeah.
It's awesome.
And so that actually makes them much more accurate werewolves as a British person looking at the British lineage than sort of your Lon Chaney's Wolfman.
Absolutely. And also, it did sort of rather, I think, actually what happened was Mayer looked at some Native American texts as well and then just bastardized them beyond belief and was like, right, that's what I'm going to do with it. And it's not necessarily the most sympathetic representation of the Quileute, which I may have pronounced wrong, but the tribe's sort of beliefs. But that's what she did with it. But yeah, in some ways it is closer to that traditional shamanistic idea, and also then to when the Christians are trying to look or interpret werewolf myth, and they're trying to argue whether do you actually change into a wolf, or do you fall asleep? Does the devil actually get into a wolf's body and do it for you and implant false memories? And there's this wonderful, huge debate about that. And there's an academic called Leslie Sconduto who looks at both French sort of text regarding the sympathetic werewolf, but also puts it within context of the medieval Christian beliefs. And she has this wonderful statement. He has this wonderful statement where he's basically talking about how the Christians are looking at, whether you actually can become a werewolf. And the moment you decide that you can't become a werewolf and that it's all fantasy, therefore metamorphosis must become metaphor, which I think is just a wonderful way of representing what then happens and allows it almost to be freed up to enter literature.
Yeah. Oh, hell yes. I mean, this is one of the things that St. Augustine was tying himself in knots about as early as that in the early church. I forget which one of his books covers this, but there's one of his whole books that covers kind of metamorphosis and the nature of it. And, it's not really people shape-shifting, it's the devil convincing everybody, including you, that you've shape-shifted. And, then it's very natural, very easy to slip it into literature. Heck yes. By the way, on just one bit of an aside on the subject of Twilight, as you probably know, Stephanie Meyer's Twilight isn't the only Twilight. There is another book called Twilight by a chap called William Gay, and that is a traumatizing, dark American Gothic about twins that are pursued through the Deep South by a mortician and a bounty hunter, and it's wonderful just to take 5 minutes to read the reviews on that, because it's full of people where the review starts 1 star, I gave this to my 12-year-old daughter. And,
what's the fellow's name? William Gay.
William Gay,
okay.
And it's called Twilight, and they've changed the cover now, but the original one was actually quite ambiguous, where you could think it was the sun going down. But it's a really beautiful American Gothic tale. It's grey, it's atmospheric, it does include a bit where the mortician kills a girl and sort of dresses her corpse up and keeps it as his girlfriend's house. And it's not like the other Twilight.
Well, I've got to say...
just the reviews on Amazon, which I found after all this, after I bought it and read it and loved it, they're hilarious.
Well, I've got to say, actually, the actual Twilight has possibly one of the worst birth scenes. It's birth by cesarean done by her partner's teeth. So Bella, when she gives birth, spoiler alert, when she gives birth to this half-human, half-vampire creature that's slowly killing her from the inside, breaks her ribs as it kicks, her stomach is covered in bruises. When she finally gives birth, she first starts throwing up blood, then her spine is cracked, and then Edward has to rip open the amniotic sac with his teeth, because that's the only strong thing to get through. They then get out this baby, start injecting venom into Bella madly to try and heal her, put the baby onto her chest, which the first thing it does is bite her breast. It's then pulled off her, taken downstairs, and then Bella basically goes into like a comatose state where she's frozen with morphine but in extreme pain for 24 hours until she comes out as a beautiful vampire. The way that vampires change in Twilight is probably one of the most disturbing ways that vampires change.
Do you like Twilight? Having said this, I know you did it, but would you on the Spooky Isles, on our website, on our Facebook forum, if you ever mention the word Twilight you get that much venom towards you. It's just not, it's ridiculous. And it's fair enough because we are probably more traditionalists in that kind of thing. Is it a decent enough book, though? Because I wouldn't ever dare read it.
It's really difficult for that one because I think that's a lot of arguments to do with taste and what is good and what is...
Like sparkly, they always talk about sparkly vampires, but what you've just said, they don't sound sparkly at all.
Well, they do. I mean, they sparkle in daylight. That's the reason why they can't go out in daylight, because they sparkle in daylight. The problem that I found when studying Twilight... Firstly, the first book, which I read, I thought it was one of the best vampire texts I'd ever read. Probably it's not the greatest written book in the world, but then I would argue that if it's got that many people reading it, it can't be that bad. But she managed to capture the essence of deferred gratification, which I thought at that point was really starting to define vampire text. So increasingly vampire text had the vampire as a romantic creature, but that you weren't allowed to ultimately have sex, and it was constantly putting it off. And even so much that this is one of the few vampire texts where biting and exchanging blood isn't seen as, maybe foreplay. If Edward bites Bella, he immediately injects her with this venom that's in his teeth. He doesn't mean to, it's a side effect, and he then has to either kill her or she will transform.
But hasn't that always been the vampire's bite? Since Dracula, it's sort of like it's the penetration hymen type of thing going on there that's a bit rude than, for this kind of forum, but yeah.
Well, that's always been part of it, I'd say, symbolically. But what's tended to happen is, so in Dracula, what happens is it's over a period of time that Dracula is biting Lucy and Mina.
Yes,
so it's a very slow sort of process. And the whole suggestion then is that this bite is like, you're right, it's like a mini version of the actual sex act. And it's then, I think you find more in later 20th century texts and early 21st century texts that actually the very bite becomes pleasurable. So when you're looking at the Sookie Stackhouse mysteries, she likes being bitten by Bill, and it's pleasurable. For Bella and Edward, it isn't pleasurable. He bites her once and she's in extreme agony, and that's it. And there's one moment where she does get bitten by another vampire, and Edward has to suck the venom out of her arm to prevent her from changing. And so it isn't.
Isn't it a kid's book? I mean, it's always seen as sort of a teenage girl's type of book, but it sounds quite gory.
It is definitely a kid's book. I think the goriness aspect is something, when it's described, it's kind of glossed over. It's only, I think, if you look at it with maybe a literary student's eyes, or you're really analysing it, that you start realising how disturbing it is.
Well, it's like Dracula. I mean, the original Dracula, it's been sort of turned into, toys and everything nowadays, and some sweets we're about to talk about later on in the interview that you've brought back from Iceland. Dracula is a horrific book.
Yes.
There's a bit in like one of the, maybe the third or fourth chapter, where there's a mother at the banging on his door, screaming at him because he's stolen her baby to give to his vampire brides. I mean, this is basically here's your, I've brought your takeaway. Here's a baby.
Yeah.
So the whole idea there is consuming infants.
It's absolutely horrific. Then you have to look, it's got, Renfield in, as you actually look at him as a mental patient within an institution in that period of time. And actually, I don't know if anyone's watched Penny Dreadful who's listening, but there is they represent an institution for people who are suffering from mental illness during the Victorian period, and you see how horrific that truly is. And I think that comes across within Renfield, with his getting his brain stashed out by Dracula. When you actually look at it, when Lucy is killed and you've got these men standing around her and they're all just they get her husband to hammer a stake into her, and she twists and turns in agony. And then afterwards, when she's just clearly dead, they all sit there going, well, that was a job well done and I'm really pleased. And I just think people don't see that as much because it has been translated, changed, morphed into Dracula becomes more and more of a sympathetic character.
Well, it's probably from the first stage versions, the Hamilton Deans, you've got this, like Bela Lugosi played him in the original Broadway version of it, and then obviously went into the Universal one in 1931. But I mean, he's a very dashing man. He's in, in his nice, what would you call it, like evening dress. This beautiful foreign accent. It's all very glamorous and stuff like that, and it's all him going down the Strand and all this kind of stuff. But I mean, in the original book, it's this old bloke who's this decrepit old character. It's not quite like Gary Oldman in the Bram Stoker's Dracula by Francis Ford Coppola, because he's got a moustache. It's more like Conde Dracula, Jess Franco's version in 1970 with Christopher Lee.
Yeah.
and you can say what you like about that film, but at least he looked more like the original Dracula. And so we've now seen this idea that Dracula is this suave, sophisticated character, as opposed to this creature who is lusting, or, as you say, sort of like it's a beastly, aggressive type of creature that doesn't exist anymore in literature. I don't know if you agree with that.
I would absolutely agree, and I think really that's why I wanted to write about Twilight, because Twilight is the sort of the ultimate, the pinnacle of that. Suddenly, the vampires are better than the humans. They are morally more upstanding. You've got Bella as a human saying to Edward, well, I'd like to have sex before marriage. And Edward going, no, I certainly can't do that. His family are incredibly decent people. His father's a doctor. His vampire parents are still together. They do wholesome activities like playing baseball together. And actually it's the human families that are broken, and it's the humans who are in no way as nice. And it's the vampires who are beautiful, and they look so healthy, and they wear fabulous clothes, and they've got really nice cars, and they become more aspirational. Which I think is really interesting. And I think, like I said, I think that really links into really the consumerism that is inherent within a lot of Gothic texts, from the very fact that they are, as a literary object, something that is consumed on a vast scale by a huge fan base. So I think that's really interesting. And therefore, I actually find the just constant blasé rudeness about Twilight quite frustrating, because we have a chance to analyse it within the context that it's being read, and we aren't doing that as much as we're just being rude and flippant about it and saying somehow it's spoilt vampires for everyone.
I've always found that argument a bit sort of silly, because I mean there's lots of stuff out there. Enjoy what you want to enjoy. As much as you've told me, I'm still not going to go read Twilight. But having said that, it sounds like what more interesting it was when I first came into this interview tonight.
But David, how can you enjoy the 1,000 Anne Rice clones spawned by the 1990s if Twilight exists? How can you enjoy the 1,000 or so books that are virtually identical to Anne Rice's Vampire Lestat books if one book that's slightly different exists? Yeah. And that seems to be the attitude, basically. It's like,
I think the one thing it does do, though, is it means that they'll focus more their attention when making films on vampires. You're more likely to get the little girl version or the teenage girl version when the Mr. Producer there with his big cigars talking, let's make a vampire film. They won't make a cool version of Dracula. They'll make a shiny version of a Twilight type clone.
Well, they've tried it with zombies, haven't they?
What's that, sorry?
They tried it with zombies. It was supposed to be satire, but they sort of did a sort of zombie...
That was warm
bodies.
Warm bodies, yeah.
So they kind of tried it with zombies.
They have got it through to zombies. I mean, recently In the Flesh, the BBC drama, did that amazingly. And actually, in some ways, I think that... I love vampires. They were the thing that really got me into monsters. I actually have an absolute fear of zombies. They give me nightmares. It's the only thing that gives me nightmares, and I have to be careful how many zombie movies I watch. But I actually think in some ways zombies are more interesting, especially with what they're trying to do with them at the moment. I think World War Z, watching the movie was disappointing.
It was very disappointing.
The book was fabulous, and I think was very clever, and I loved what Max Brooks did with the zombie.
Because that was almost similar to Dracula, with all the different reports, news reports, letters, and things. I've not read World War Z, the book, but I know what it's supposed to be like. So.
And certainly, like Dracula, I think it gives it that sort of authenticity, because that's the thing I find very amusing. People talk about Dracula as, it's so authentic. Well, it's not really. I mean, Bram Stoker, he very cleverly writes within the text Dracula's life story, and he's sort of leeching off certain aspects like Vlad the Impaler, despite the fact there is no real connection between vampires and Vlad the Impaler, and he's leeching off these travel logs that he's been reading, like Emily Gerard's The Land Beyond the Forest. He even takes a great deal from Sabine Baring-Gould's The Book of Werewolves. He takes it from German Gothic stories. So he gives this veneer of authenticity from the very way that it's written, with the letters, with the first-hand accounts, but also by creating this faux history, this meta-history almost. And I think that's what Max Brooks does with the zombies, in that he creates a fully immersive world, and he then writes, How to Survive a Zombie Apocalypse, which, is a very necessary book. Everyone should have it. I have it at home, keep it close by me. But, I think they've actually done something quite similar there, which is very interesting.
So we've now moved on to zombies, but I want to drag us back to werewolves, just because you're doing your PhD, and I don't think we'd have many opportunities to sit with a PhD candidate who's run on werewolves. So let's forget about the zombies, because when you come back to do your
doctoral thesis on zombies,
we'll talk about that then. Okay. Why do you think vampires are more popular than werewolves at the moment?
Wow, that's the $1 million question.
That's
really.
why I asked it.
And that's basically what I've spent the last 8 months madly trying to look at. And I haven't necessarily got the ultimate answer. I can give you my suggestions. And I suspect in some ways it's because vampires, when they sort of come into Western culture during the 1700s, after you have the accounts from Austro-Hungarian soldiers within the Serbian sort of area about the digging up of bodies, I think vampires have a novelty aspect. Whereas by that period of time, within Europe, within Western Europe, you've had the werewolf trials within France in the 1500s and 1600s. You've also had a number of other werewolf trials within Germany. So actually, werewolves aren't really considered to be that new or exciting.
They're a bit boring, really.
Yeah.
It's just like, werewolves are all over the place. Big deal.
Montague Summers makes a very apt point in an otherwise mental book about werewolves, in The Werewolf. He says, to be honest, it's almost impossible to read everything that was written about werewolves in the 1500s and 1600s. And again, Emily Gerard, when she writes about the Romanian werewolf, or were-dog, the Prikulich, in The Land Beyond the Forest, she says, it's the long exploded werewolf. We've already heard so much about it. So the vampire comes in almost shiny and new in the 1700s, and is then quite quickly picked up, and I am really just glossing over, quite quickly picked up really by the Romantics. And it then divorces almost from its folkloric past. And it becomes a symbol for the Romantics, and it enters literature. And I think that offers it so much more flexibility. So even within the text, with the short stories or the stories about vampires in the Victorian period, there is a huge difference among them. Sometimes they're invisible, sometimes they're sort of like a ghost, sometimes there's, they're actually, they're shapeshifters, sometimes they are corpses coming back, sometimes they are incredibly rich aristocrats. There's a lot of flexibility. Whereas what I noticed when I was looking at the werewolf within literature is, again, it comes in very heavily in the 1800s. There's probably 2 other main mentions of werewolves prior to the 1800s, and that's actually, they refer to them as lycanthropes, and that's in The Duchess of Malfi by John Webster in 1614. And then again, it's in the Albigenesis, which is a Gothic text by Maturin, Charles Maturin. And they are talking by lycanthropy as the disease, which has been discussed on Melancholia. But when it actually comes into literature itself, it's in the 1800s, it's in short stories. And what I noticed when looking at all these short stories is they're very repetitive. Very repetitive. The same themes come up. They tend to be set in the medieval period. They, again, owe a lot more to Gothic texts as opposed to maybe ideas about the werewolf. They have a lot of anti-Roman Catholicism coming up through them. So I think it's just that the vampire was more flexible. And I think, really, for me, the crux was in Dracula, because Dracula as a character is almost as much werewolf as he is vampire. But no one ever discusses Count Dracula as the ultimate werewolf.
In fact, Coppola is almost the only person who ever showed him in his wolf form.
Absolutely.
Because when he's sort of seducing Lucy and things, you get a couple of bits of him in his wolf form. There's the famous freeze frame in The Flash where you see him in his half-wolf form if you are sad as I am and flip through it frame by frame. Yeah, it's... But the thing is, what is aspiration about a werewolf? I mean, unless you've got a bit of zoophilia going on, I mean, really,
I've always
what
thought,
is aspirational
I'd
about
actually,
a werewolf?
like, as silly as it might think, would you rather be a vampire or a werewolf? I actually think werewolves would be sort of kind of cool a bit, because you get to sort of like be wild and kill and do horrendous things. Whereas vampires always seem to be very, like, very melancholy and sort of, like, not enjoying it as much as,
On the other hand, if you go into the pseudo-historical werewolf,
Yeah.
the sort of... Because there's a bit of a werewolf explosion in the historical texts of about the 12th century. Gerald of Wales writes about them. Gerald of Wales, Nennius, and at least one other writes about them in that period. Gervase of Tilbury is the one who brings in the moon.
Yes.
But annoyingly, in the book I was reading this in, he says, I won't bore you with how the moon got brought in by Gervase of Tilbury. And I'm like, no, bore me with that. I think that's really important. Please bore me with that. But, so there's a bit of a sort of werewolf explosion, but in that, it's characterised by terrible anxiety.
Yeah.
Because, the Irish werewolves, one of the big mythological strands for them is they're cursed by St. Patrick. They were making wolf noises to heckle St. Patrick while he was trying to sort of teach them Christianity. And so he curses them, but every 7 years they'll become wolves.
Well, that'll learn them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is... I think the other thing, really, and you're sort of touching on it, is, well, werewolves, other than the few texts in France, so I'm thinking William of Pellerne, or William the Werewolf as it's translated, or the Lay of the Werewolf by Marie de France, basically werewolves are also peasants in the main, and the werewolf trials, they're mad peasants.
Well, in Underworld, that's what they're like, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're the sort of the slaves of the vampires, the lycans of the slaves.
There is one posh werewolf. Now, it's a medieval text. It is a story of a knight who is a werewolf. It's a French one. I cannot remember what it's called. You might know it better than I do.
Is it the one where he is tricked by his wife who steals his clothes?
Text. Yes.
Yeah, it's The Lay of the Werewolf by Marie de France.
Yeah, and he's the one posh werewolf I know of.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's after that they sort of suddenly get twisted back into being peasants.
Yeah.
And some argue, I've read some people who've argued that in part it's because as our land becomes both more... maybe Christianized isn't the word, but the church has more power, then followed by the rise in sheep farming and relying on animals, suddenly the wolf becomes more horrific. Rather than something that a creature that you're almost starting to live side by side, or you just accepted, okay, there's wolves, they're going to kill a few of my flock. Suddenly when you completely relied on your flock, and then you heard the same language reiterated, echoed within a religious text about us being the flock of the Lord, the devil being like a wolf, then you start having the werewolf becoming more and more aggressive. And then, within sort of, I guess, the werewolf trials, which coincide with the witch trials, that's when you start really looking at the peasants becoming, werewolves. But you are right to say that aspect, that second-class citizen aspect of the werewolf continues even today. So most representations of the werewolf will tend to show them as being working class, less control.
Well, if you think about like Larry Talbot in The Wolfman, American, sort of, not quite as classy as even though he's, coming back to Wales.
Yes.
For his, he's still seen as this sort of colonial, not quite as good American, crass, whatever word you want to use.
Brash American.
Brash American's the thing I'm trying to say. And he's come back and he becomes the werewolf.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite interesting because it's almost as though the stories have replicated the lack of popularity of the werewolf, and they've made them actually second-class citizens within the narratives themselves, which just reflects the fact that the vampire has always been more popular. And for me, I think one of the other things is the way that people have represented werewolves in that they are partly animalistic, well, very animalistic, and I think we do associate being animalistic, being like an animal, as something that's incredibly negative. Whereas the vampires, in a very crude sense, are simply overcoming death, which is something that we all aspire to do. And the other thing about werewolves is often when they become into their werewolf state, they have no self-control and they have no memory. And they completely give over to this animal side. So you can't even really enjoy it. You just wake up and go, oh, there's a lot of dead bodies and I'm covered in blood. And it's almost a bit like the Hulk, really.
Yeah.
And it represents lack of control.
Well, even in The Lay of the Werewolf, you get that, actually.
Yeah.
Because after he turns into a wolf, when he finally gets back to humanity, he just falls asleep. And you get the impression when he wakes up, it's all gone. He remembers he was a wolf, but that's about it.
Yeah. What's interesting, we talk about werewolves. We're within a couple of blocks of Tottenham Court Road Station, which was where they didn't film American Werewolf in London, but it's set there. I think it was actually filmed at Charing Cross. So that's an iconic film. What would be your favourite werewolf film?
Ginger Snaps.
Okay,
That's a great one.
I don't even have to think about that.
Tell us about that Canadian film.
Why? Well, again, it was something that I just stumbled across with my sister. I think I'd read a review of it in The Guardian that said it had a very feminist edge to it, and I was like, I'm going to watch that. And me and my sister sat and watched it, and it was just hilarious. I think it's because it is about two sisters, which is probably very nice when I was watching it with my sister, because it is so incredibly dark. It opens with this slideshow that they've made of themselves dying in various horrible ways. And I think because it is so fun to see a female werewolf, and you actually don't see that many female werewolves. And what's actually quite interesting is, again, in this when Ginger Snaps, the female werewolf is very pale. She's almost a white wolf, and you see that when there are female werewolves, they tend to be white wolves. So I quite enjoyed that aspect of it. It had a cute drug dealer in it, so I was sold as a teenage girl. I can't quote most of the best lines in it because they're so incredibly rude, but it was very bloody, it was very visceral, but it had a lot of fun playing with ideas like menstruation and things like that. So I think that's why I liked it so much. It was just funny.
John, what would your favourite werewolf film be?
Ooh, now I thought about this. It is not wholly a werewolf movie, but it is a movie with a monster wolf in it.
Okay.
Brotherhood of the Wolf.
Good.
Tell us about that film.
Now, Brotherhood of the Wolf, I believe, is about a specific French incident. It begins with a G.
The Beast of Govardhan.
That's the one. And basically, it was this. We know this monster really existed. It killed about 100 people before finally being killed. And the movie is about this guy who goes there to hunt the monster. He's got his, I believe, Native American kung fu sidekick.
Yeah.
And you know what? That should be ridiculous, and it isn't. It's a testament to this film, right? That you see the Native American kung fu sidekick kicking ass left, right, and centre, and the film is amazing, and that doesn't spoil it in any way. It's one of the earliest times that I saw the great French actor, oh crumbs, I've forgotten his name, the guy who plays the evil sort of nobleman in it.
It's gone.
Vincent Cassel.
Yep.
And he plays this sort of very icy, amazing one-armed nobleman. And do you know what? It's just a great movie. It's a great piece of art as well as a good action movie. There's a bit where they get very, very proper werewolf myth because they decide to deal with it by the Native American guy makes up a hallucinogenic sort of, I believe it's a drink or a paste for them, and then they trip their boxes off in the forest and run around screaming and sort of believing they're shape-shifting and things in one scene. So yeah, it's awesome. It's got a little bit of everything in it.
Doesn't it have Monica Bellucci in it as well?
Oh yeah. I mean, yes.
Okay,
yes,
that
it
has
does.
nothing to do with it.
That actress that I respect immensely is in that film.
Oh, that seems like a good reason to watch it then.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, I suppose The Moon Rises and Sets on American Werewolf in London.
Yeah.
It's the first horror film I ever saw. Mum got it out on video one night, and when we were about 8 or something like that, and she just thought it was a comedy and didn't think anything of it. And and then when things, this man's got he's rotting in front of us, and there's a bloke screaming on the ground with his bones breaking and all that kind of stuff. So that was a fantastic film to see.
Yeah.
The one I would mention would be A Company of Wolves.
Yes.
Oh, that's a great movie.
That had some amazing special effects in it as well, because you actually see the werewolves. They sort of turn into werewolves by almost turning inside out, so that the muzzle comes through the mouth, and that always impressed me as well. So you've got lots of stuff that I don't quite understand, and I imagine you probably need a PhD to understand some of the things that happen in Company of Wolves, because it was all full of young girls going through puberty and things like that.
It's based on Angela Carter's short story book, and so that's one of the things about it. It's a Pimento Stories film. And it's based on all her sort of ideas of sort of all her symbolism and things. And
yeah.
So a lot of it is little bites.
Yeah.
Which
I've probably not seen it in over 20 years, so I can't really say. But I just remember at the time, because I was so fascinated by the different. And there's something we haven't actually talked about tonight, was actually the transformation of the werewolves, because that's probably the real fascinating thing about it as well. But we don't have a lot more time. But what Kaja's done, she's brought us in some Swedes. She could tell us about them.
Okay, so I went to Iceland not that long ago.
Iceland, the country?
Iceland, the country,
Yes, not the frozen goods
Mums
shop.
went to Iceland.
Yes.
And I went to stay with my friend in Reykjavik. And when I arrived at Keflavik Airport, I thought, I'll get myself a cup of tea and I'll get myself some sweets for the journey to Reykjavik. And I saw these sweets and they said Dracula on them. And I was like, woohoo! Then it turns out they're made in Denmark. And as my name might suggest, my grandfather on my dad's side was Danish. So I got really excited. So I got them and I put one in my mouth and I immediately spat it out. It was the most disgusting thing I have ever tasted. For 2 days afterwards, every time I thought about the taste, I started gagging. So I brought them in for everyone to try.
Okay, so we're going to do this. So
Right, let's do it.
So here we go. Dracula classic. I can't, but it's got a Dracula, your classic sort of looking bad dude on there. So John, you take one.
I love this.
Right,
It's
so
like,
just we'll
John,
do-
you be our tester. Me.
No, I'm going to do one as well. Now,
This looks like a fisherman's friend.
It looks like a fisherman's friend, so let's go for it.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am not trying these again because I've already tried
All right,
them
I'm
once.
describing the flavour. It's a salty Marmite fisherman's friend.
Yes.
It's also fizzy as well.
What the hell are they thinking?
I
what
don't
are
know.
these crazy Danes doing with themselves?
It's got ammonium chloride in it, if that makes you feel any
Oh.
better.
Do you know what?
It's absolutely disgusting, isn't it?
I'm going to swallow it because I just want it out of my mouth.
Well,
It is
you can have some to spit
salty,
it out.
No.
licorice fisherman's friend.
But it had that fizziness to it. It was like, anyway, you don't need to.
You know what?
anything
This
more.
is actually the sweet produced by a country that gives you salty licorice. Or is that the Swedes?
Oh, they-
No.
it's actually not that
Iceland
bad.
and
Actually,
Spain.
after swallowing it, I wouldn't get into them, but certainly better anyway. Well,
Oh, good lord, this is leaving my
John
mouth.
actually can't finish it.
all right.
so
Well, anyway,
we'll give
that's
some paper to put
It's
it on.
not going into my stomach and it's not staying in my
All
mouth.
right, well, okay,
I'm
well,
going to make it disappear.
we don't need to look at that. All right. Anyway, that's all the time we have for this evening. It's been fun to talk about vampires and werewolves. We've been very highbrow, more highbrow than I think I've been about this subject for a very long time, if at all, ever. And I'd like to thank our very special guest, Kaja Franck, for joining us here at the King and Queen in central London tonight. Thank you, Kaja.
My absolute pleasure.
And
Definitely.
hopefully you might come return one day so
I'd
we
love
could
to, yes.
raise the bar of conversation here at Castle Spooky.
Oh, yes.
And also, I'd like to thank my co-host, John Kanako-James, for his always insightful comments. And so until next time, this is David Saunderson for the Spooky Isles. Have a spooky evening.
Thank you.
You have been listening to The Spooky Isles, hosted by David Saunderson and John Kanako-James with assistance from Lorcan Maguire. You can visit the Spooky Isles website for more tales of ghosts, horror, and dark history in the UK and Ireland at spookyisles.com. This is Anthony M.R. Lewis speaking.